Hey, welcome back to my Philosophy Compass series. In these videos, I summarize and expand upon the contents of peer-reviewed Philosophy Compass articles. Now, today we'll be covering Josh Rasmussen's article on Cosmological Arguments from Contingency. So let's dig in. So the general argumentative pattern here is one wherein we say that there must be some reason or explanation for the existence of contingent, that is to say, non-necessary things, and that the only adequate explanation is, at least in part, in terms of a concrete being whose non-existence is metaphysically impossible, that is to say, a necessary being. Now, Josh breaks the cosmological argument from contingency, or the family of arguments, into two stages. Okay, so stage one has two steps within it. Okay, the first step is a causal or explanatory principle, something along the lines of every contingent reality of category C has, or at least possibly has, a cause or explanation. So that's step one within stage one. And then step two in stage one is from contingency to a necessary being. So for reason R, there is a contingent reality X of category C such that X could not have been caused or explained by a contingent reality alone. Okay? And so from those, it follows that there's a non-contingent, that is to say necessary reality N, that serves as at least part of the cause or explanation of X. So the goal of stage one is really just contingent reality, in some sense, depends ultimately upon a self-existent necessary reality. So that's stage one with its two steps. And then stage two attempts to reason from necessary being to God. So for reasons S, N has certain godlike features, such as immateriality, for instance, or limitlessness, or volitional capacity, or omnipotence, or what have you. So with the general argumentative structure laid out, we can now get into the nitty-gritty details in stage one. So let's first focus on the step one of stage one, which is choosing a causal principle. Okay? The ideal principle connects the feature being contingent with the feature of having a cause or explanation in a systematic and plausible way. Now, there are 5 sub-steps within step one that we have to get clear on. So the first of these is the meaning of explanation and causation. The second is the meaning of contingent reality. The third is the specification of the category C of contingent realities to be explained. The fourth is the causal principle's logical strength. And the fifth is reasons to accept a causal principle. And let's cover each of these in turn. Okay, so the first sub-step within step one of stage one, it's a little bit complex, but hopefully you're keeping up with me. The first sub-step is getting clear on what we mean by explanation and causation. So an explanation is supposed to answer, at least to some extent, why a certain situation obtains. It sort of removes mystery or puzzlement as to why something is the case. The explanation tells us why the explanandum, that is to say, the situation or state of affairs or substance being explained, the explanation tells us why that explanandum actually obtains. And notice that explanations can connect facts involving either concrete or abstract entities, right? So like the fact that there's a water bottle here is presumably explained in terms of, well, right now, I mean, it's chemical molecular structure, but also a factory that produced it. So that's a sort of causal explanation within the realm of concreta. But, arguably there are also explanations within the realm of abstracta. So for instance, the Pythagorean theorem might be explained in terms of certain more fundamental basic principles of mathematics and geometry. Now, causal explanation, however, only includes concrete entities and their causal activity. And since contingency arguments propose an explanation in terms of a necessarily existent concrete being, right? We're not trying to get to a necessarily existent abstract thing. We're trying to get to a necessary concrete being. It's crucial that they employ causal explanations. And so now with the relevant notions of causation and explanation in play, we can go on to step two or the sub-step two within step one of stage one. So recall that sub-step 2 deals with contingent and necessary existence. So contingency can be helpfully understood in terms of possible worlds. Now, X is a contingent reality if and only if X exists or obtains in some, but not all, possible worlds. That is to say, X can fail to exist or obtain. X is possibly absent from reality. And a possible world is just a complete way the world, i.e. all of reality, could be or could have been. I mean, more technically and more precisely, a possible world W can be thought of as a proposition such that for every possibly true proposition, W either entails it or its negation. In contrast to a contingent reality, X is a necessary reality if and only if X exists or obtains in all possible worlds. That is to say, X cannot fail to exist or obtain. So substep 3 within the first step of stage 1 is specifying the category C of contingent realities to which the causal principle applies. So some contingency arguments apply to events, others to concrete things or substances, and still others to facts, i.e. obtaining states of affairs. Other examples include basic facts, wholly contingent facts, wholly contingent pluralities, and so on. So Josh, in his article, focuses on 3: contingent fact, contingent concrete thing, and fact concerning the existence of contingent things. According to the first causal principle that we'll consider, let's call it C1, every contingent fact whatsoever has an explanation. The primary disadvantage of this causal principle C1 is that its generality seems to leave it amenable to counterexamples. So take, for instance, the fact that there are the very things that there are, where that's a rigid plural designator. Now call this fact the big F, okay? So the big F is contingent so long as there is at least one contingent thing. But, what could possibly explain why the big F obtains, considering that, everything, including non-contingent things, is contained within the big F? Like, wouldn't it be circular if one or more things within the big F explained why the big F obtained at all in the first place? So, how might the defender of this first causal principle respond to this? Well, consider again the big F. Well, this fact can be explained if we accept the following proposal. If X is explained, and X entails Y, then Y is thereby explained. That is to say, if X, for example, the fact that there are the contingent things that there are, entails Y, for example, the big F, then Y is adequately explained by 1. Whatever explains X, plus 2. The fact that X entails Y. Now, the fact that there are the contingent things that there are entails the big F, given that it trivially entails the existence of all the contingent things, and the existence of any non-contingent things is entailed by the existence of anything. And thus, if the fact that there are the contingent things that there are can be explained, well, then the big F can be explained without circularity. Now, one of the problems with this is just that it's not always the case that if we have an explanation of X is obtaining, and X is obtaining entails Y is obtaining, then we have an explanation of Y is obtaining, right? Because consider penguins. Don't you want to consider? We all love penguins, right? But I think penguins can help us see why this principle is just incorrect, right? For we have an explanation of why there are penguins, namely some causal, historical, evolutionary account. And there being penguins entails that it's not the case that there's nothing in reality. But clearly we haven't explained why it's false that there's something in reality by appealing to some causal or historical evolutionary account, right? Because our explanation of why there are penguins actually presupposes that there's something in reality, right? So we haven't explained why there's something in reality merely by, explaining the existence of penguins and then the existence of penguins entailing that there's something in reality. This principle seems implausible. So a second potential counterexample to this first causal principle is to consider a contingent fact, let's call that fact C, that entails every other contingent fact. Like, for instance, it could just be like a conjunction of all contingent facts. Who knows? So fact C seems to pose a problem for a cosmological argument from contingency relying on this first causal principle. Because C is supposed to be explained in part by the contingent causal activity of a necessary being. And that means that the very causal activity that's supposed to explain C is included in C. But isn't that circular? So, one way to avoid this problem the defender of C1 could take is just to say that some contingent facts might be self-explanatory. So Alex Proust proposes this in his book on the principle of sufficient reason, where he says that perhaps certain freely willed actions for reasons R1 through Rn are, they just point to their own intelligibility. Perhaps they are self-explained in some sense. Now, this certainly isn't the end of the story, but we have to move on to other alleged counterexamples to the first causal principle. So other alleged counterexamples to this causal principle are, well, precisely facts concerning free-willed actions, right? I mean, it seems as though contrastive facts, which are going to be contingent facts, are going to lack explanations. Like, maybe we can explain why the person chose vanilla, but, we're not going to be able to explain, at least in most cases, why the person chose vanilla rather than chocolate, or as opposed to chocolate. Other potential counterexamples to this first causal principle are facts concerning quantum events, so quantum indeterminacy, or facts about what doesn't occur. Now, note that appealing to indeterministic explanations won't help the defender of C1, because indeterministic explanations, by their very nature, cannot provide an adequate explanation of every part of the explanandum. Like, there will be contingent facts left unexplained. That's just the nature of the indeterministic the processes in question. So, I mean, it just seems as though we need another causal principle, not C1. So a second causal principle, call it C2, is that every contingent concrete thing has a cause of its existence. So this is less amenable to counterexamples, because it only concerns the existence of concrete entities. We're not talking about any contingent fact whatsoever like C1. But the primary disadvantage is just that it's harder to mark out a path to a necessary being. For instance, you'd probably have to argue against infinite causal regresses, most arguments of which are controversial, in order to get to a necessary being under this causal principle. Alternatively, and this is an interesting path, you could argue that it's just at least possible for there to be a finite causal chain in respect of the existence of concrete objects. And hence it's possible for there to be an uncaused contingent thing, but per causal principle 2, every contingent concrete thing has a cause of its existence, and so if there's an uncaused concrete thing, well then that thing must be necessary. And so this path from possibility might be interesting and doesn't require you to say that, oh well, all causal chains whatsoever are finite. Alas, one might respond that we need an independent reason for thinking that this is possible, given that there are other possibility premises in the vicinity that undercut the argument in question. Now, a third and final causal principle, C3, is that every fact concerning the existence of contingent concrete things has an explanation. Now, this principle seems to avoid the primary costs of C1 and C2. It's not as general as C1, and so doesn't require an explanation of the big F or, the causal activity of a being, and it can be used in an argument for a necessary being without presupposing the necessity or even the possibility of a finite causal chain. So now that we've investigated the third sub-step, namely choosing a causal principle, and we've seen that this C3 is probably the most plausible one, we can move on to the fourth sub-step within step 1, which is concerning the logical strength of the causal principle in question. So the strongest of these is going to be necessary causal principles. So causal principles that are necessarily true, admitting of no exceptions whatsoever. Weaker versions allow for the possibility of exceptions, but deny exceptions in the actual world. Weaker still, we can appeal to defeasible reasoning. So that allows for exceptions in the actual world, but shifts the burden of proof to the skeptic to show how a given case is an exception. Otherwise, there's a sort of prima facie defeasible evidence against it. Even weaker still is that contingent realities of a certain category merely can have a cause or explanation. And if you go down this path, you're going to have to, if you want to infer a necessary being, you're going to have to combine it with certain axioms or principles of modal logic. So the fifth sub-step within this step 1 of stage 1 concerns reasons to believe in a causal principle. Okay, so one path or one justification offered in favor of the causal principles in question is that one or more of them are just self-evident or supportable a priori. So I mean consider you're in a forest and you stumble upon a transparent orb or 30,000 transparent orbs. I mean you just think someone was insane if they suggested that, oh well, there's no explanation for this. It's just a brute fact. I mean, it's just an inexplicable occurrence. I mean, it's just there. There's no explanation. I mean, we'd be like, no, that's insane. Right? There has to be an explanation. I mean, just intuitively, like a priori. I mean, just considering this case, it seems as though we can just see that it requires an explanation. It cries out for one. And if that's the case, well then, it seems as though we can support certain causal principles like this a priori, right? Because, well, what's the difference between a transparent orb and, for instance, like an apple or water or, a particle or, a quantum field or, something the size of the universe? A second reason one might provide for such causal principles is that, they provide the best or simplest explanation of data, usually empirical, concerning causal interactions known to occur. So, for instance, what explains why, 1,000 photons don't just pop right in front of me? Well, a simple and powerful explanation is just that that'd be impossible absent some, sufficient reason or cause or explanation as to how that could occur. A third kind of reason that one might, support these principles is by appealing to certain troubling epistemological implications of granting that there could be contingent facts that lack an explanation. So, for instance, one's present perceptual states might, for all one knows, be occurring for no reason at all. Also, the seemingly best explanation of a given set of data might be, no more likely than the explanation at all, and that would undermine all of science. A third way that one might pinpoint troubling epistemological implications is that we'd have no grounds for thinking it unlikely for arbitrarily large numbers of macro-sized objects to suddenly appear on your front porch, say, without a cause. Now, of course, there's further discussion and debate to be had on whether or not these epistemological implications are indeed implications of denying it, or, whether or not we can avoid these difficulties by appeal to some other principles, not invoking these causal principles. But, that suffices for a short discussion on it for here. Okay, so now let's focus on step 2 of stage 1, from contingency to a necessary being. Now in step 2, recall that we're trying to give a reason R for thinking that there is a contingent reality of category C, such that such a reality could not have been causally explained by a contingent reality alone, and hence we'd have to appeal to some necessary reality to explain it. Now, the specification of this reason R depends quite heavily on the specification of C. And so Josh discusses one classic example, serving this role. So, premise 1, every contingent fact concerning the existence of contingent things has an explanation. So that's the C3 causal principle. Now, premise 2, the big C, the fact that there are, or ever were, the very contingent things that there are, or ever were, is itself a contingent fact concerning the existence of contingent things. And per those two premises, it follows that the big C has an explanation. But no fact concerning the existence of contingent things can be explained solely in terms of one or more of those very things that it contains. And hence, the big C, precisely because every contingent thing is contained within it, the big C must be explained at least in part by something that is not contingent, that is to say, a necessary being. So in this case, R is a kind of no circularity condition. A fact concerning the existence of certain things cannot be adequately explained solely in terms of those very things, one or more of them, for that would be circular. One of the motivations for this is that, merely causally linking things up to one another doesn't account for, why any of those things ever existed at all in the first place. Why do those things exist rather than different ones that are linked up in different ways, or none at all, right? Something other than those things seems to be needed if their existence is to be adequately explained. One might respond that, why can't we just explain the total fact, the big C, in virtue of, explaining each of the things within the big C. So, for instance, if we had a bunch of Eskimos on the corner of a street, couldn't we explain the fact that, those Eskimos are there, all of them are there, by explaining why each one is there? Now, one problem with this is that, it just seems intuitively plausible that an explanation is adequate only if at least part of the explanation is in terms of explanatory factors wholly outside the fact to be explained, right? So, suppose that I told you that each Eskimo is on that corner because another of the Eskimos happens to be on that corner. Well, then, if that were the case, that wouldn't be an acceptable explanation as to why the Eskimos are there, right? I would just be saying, well, Eskimo 1 is there because of Eskimo 2 is there, and Eskimo 2 is there because Eskimo 3 is there, and Eskimo 3 is there because Eskimo 1 is there. No, we've just gone around in a circle. We need to appeal to something outside of those very Eskimos in order to account for why they're there in the first place. And notice that the example of, the Eskimos on the corner of the street, we can account for that in terms of facts that are indeed outside of the, those very Eskimos. For instance, perhaps one of them is there because he's trying to catch a bus. The other one's there because he just got chocolates for his wife. The other one's there because, I don't know, he wanted to watch a philosophy lecture from me. I don't know. So yes, I know there's so much more we could cover, so much more we could say, so much more we could investigate. I mean, this is so exciting. But I think that suffices for now for step 2 of stage 1, and now we can go on to stage 2. So recall that stage 2 attempts to infer God's existence from the existence of a necessary being. And so, the divine attributes that Josh considers are eternal, immaterial, personal, and being unlimited. So let's consider eternality. One argument for eternality is that something is eternal if it never started to exist and will never cease to exist. But if something starts to exist or ceases to exist, surely its non-existence is possible. And hence, if something's non-existence is not possible, well then the being never started to exist and never will cease to exist. And so the necessary being is eternal on this account. Now, one problem with this is that it kind of seems questionable, that premise that if something starts to exist or ceases to exist, then its non-existence is possible, because there's no strict entailment from a being's existing in every possible world to its existing at every time in every possible world. For instance, I mean, perhaps the necessary being exists at some time or other, but not at every single time. Now, one response to that worry is that, oh, well, that worry would only work under eternalism, right? Because under presentism, well, if something exists at some time but not at another time, well then, at that time where it doesn't exist, it just doesn't exist simpliciter, and hence its non-existence is obviously possible simpliciter because its non-existence is actual simpliciter, right? And so it seems as though that account, that objection that I was just giving to that argument, it seems as though it assumes eternalism. Now, again, this might be a sticking point for the argument in question because someone could easily just say, well, listen, I accept eternalism, and so you haven't given me a reason to think that this being doesn't have, temporal boundaries. So let's move on to immateriality, a second divine attribute that we might try to infer. So one way we could go about this is just saying, well, I mean, every material thing is such that it's, conceivably non-existent, and since conceivability is, prima facie defeasible evidence for possibility, we have reason to think that, every material object possibly doesn't exist, right? But the necessary being, it's just false that it possibly doesn't exist, right? It necessarily exists, and hence we have reason to think that it's immaterial. Now again, one might respond that, conceivability runs the other way, right? So, I mean, it certainly seems conceivable that this necessarily existent being is material, and, if that's conceivably necessarily the case, and if conceivability provides evidence for possibility, then we have equal evidence for the possibility of, this material thing being necessarily existent, and hence it seems as though we have a sort of symmetry breaker. We also need to keep in mind the difference between seeing possibility versus failing to see impossibility, right? So, when we're conceiving the non-existence of material objects, we might just be failing to see that it's impossible for there to be no material objects, as opposed to seeing that it's possible for there to be no material objects. So, it seems as though we need to be very careful and cautious. We need to make sure that we actually are seeing possibility. Another way one might try to get to immateriality is as follows. First, material objects are contingent, but the necessary being isn't contingent, and so the necessary being is immaterial. But I mean, once again, I do kind of worry that the first thing that I said, that premise 1, that material objects are contingent, I worry that begs the question, right? I mean, it's the very question at issue as to whether all material objects are contingent. But I mean, perhaps we could mount, I don't know, certain defeasible reasons for one, thereby rationally justifying us in believing it, until presented with sufficient defeater to the contrary. This would end up shifting the burden of proof to the proponent of ens materiality. Though, this may not be too bad. I mean, any argument for naturalism would do it, and if you're trying to give a naturalist reasons to think that the necessary being is a godlike rather than naturalistic being, well then the naturalist will almost certainly have such independent reasons for his or her naturalism. So, I don't know, it's not clear to me that this sort of defeasible evidence in favor of one approach to avoid the question-begging worry, it's not immediately clear to me that that's going to work. Another way we might argue for immateriality is as follows. So first, we could argue that there could have been one fewer fundamental particle or field or what have you. That seems intuitive, and it seems to be conceivably, that seems to be conceivable. And so from that, it follows that at least one fundamental particle or field or what have you is contingent. But if at least one fundamental particle or field or what have you is contingent, well, then it seems as though we have reason to think that all are contingent, right? Like what relevant difference could we point to? And moreover, we have a sort of categorical uniformity. If one thing of a category is such that it's contingent, well, then it seems as though that gives us reason to think that, the modal properties of other members of the same category, namely, fundamental particle, for instance, also have that modal property. But non-fundamental material things are contingent, right? But also now we've shown that the fundamental material things are contingent, right? But if n is material, then n would either be a fundamental material thing or a non-fundamental material thing, right? So in which case, since neither of those can be necessary, since both of those are contingent, but n is necessary, it would follow that n, the necessary being, is immaterial. Now, one response to this is that it just assumes that there's a multiplicity of fundamental particles or fields, right? So perhaps the naturalist will just say that no, there's perhaps these are just less fundamental than the single necessary natural foundation of reality. Like, who knows, matter or energy or some unique unifying quantum field. A second response to this argument is that, the first premise, it seems as though we could have conceivability running in the exact opposite direction. We could, it certainly seems conceivable that the types of fundamental particles that there are necessary. Finally, another strategy that one could take with respect to immateriality is to argue for other things first, like personhood or being unlimited, and then show that immateriality of such a being on the basis of these. So, for instance, every material object is limited in various regards, or, every material person is contingent, given, that material persons are usually complex, fragile, organism-like beings, which are decidedly contingent, and so on. So, you could go through immateriality in less direct routes by going through, personhood or eternality or, limitlessness. So now let's turn to personhood. So one way that one might argue for the personhood of the necessary being is that if n, the necessary being, lacked the capacity to choose to cause non-necessary things, well, then the effects of n would flow deterministically from n, which would entail that everything's necessary. And since it's false that everything is necessary, n must have the capacity of free choice and is therefore a personal agent. Now, there are two major problems for this. First, indeterministic causation need not be volitional, right? It could just be like a stochastic or indeterministic physical event, say. Also, it seems as though modal collapse doesn't automatically follow in this case. Why? Well, because it seems that n could necessarily give rise to another necessary being n star, but the holistic system n star could have an irreducible probabilistic causal power not possessed by either of n or n star individually. And so even assuming that a concrete object which produces effects indeterministically must be volitional, we wouldn't be able to conclude that n has volitional capacity, since in the described scenario neither n nor n star are concrete objects which produce effects indeterministically. And modal collapse, moreover, is averted on this scenario. So it seems as though the modal collapse argument for the personhood of the necessary being is not going to work for the aforementioned two reasons. And finally, we can turn to the fourth divine attribute that we might try to infer, infiniteness, or limitlessness, or boundlessness, or just being unlimited. So one way to go about this is that we could say that, limitation entails the possibility for increase or decrease. So if you have a limit to degree d, it seems at least possible for you to have a limit to degree d plus 1 or d minus 1. And so the fact that you have a limit to degree d seems to entail the possibility for increase or decrease. Now, you can see my non-traditional arguments for theism, part 1 out of 2, for certain criticisms of, the limitation and increase and decrease and contingency and necessary being worries. But just for now, I'll summarize them. So first, it seems as though we have a desire problem, right? So desires come in degrees, but, if this being is such that, it's unlimited, then it seems as though it's going to have unlimited desires. But, if that's the case, well, then it seems as though we're going to be collapsing any predictive ability or power that we could make with respect to this being, if there are two incompatible states of affairs, both of which have some desirability, some goodness to them, but, because such a being would have unlimited desire for both of them to obtain. So it seems as though we're just collapsing our predictive power with respect to bringing them about. And this can be generalized to get some really interesting problems, but I can save those for another episode. A second problem with this limitation entails the possibility for increase or decrease, is the Trinity problem, as I mentioned in that video. Namely, it seems as though it could not have been the case that there were 4 persons in the Trinity or 2 persons in the Trinity, right? But nevertheless, there's a limited number of persons in the Trinity. It's 3, and that does not entail the possibility for increase or decrease, so it seems to be a counterexample. And then finally, many people will also find it plausible, or perhaps even self-evidently possible, that there could be necessarily obtaining limits. So perhaps it's simply necessary that n has a certain finite degree of power. Once again, there are just countless things that we could, continue pursuing. These matters are, almost infinitely complex. I guess you could say that their complexity is limitless. That was so bad. Anyway, my point is just that, this is nowhere near the end of the debate. Actually, this is just like a summary. Really? I'm not trying to present, a case for any position here, really. I'm just presenting a summary of a Philosophy Compass article and expanding upon it occasionally in certain places. So, yeah, this certainly isn't the end of the debate. And, there are so many different things that we could bring to bear from, limitation and modal logic and, modal epistemology. There are so many different avenues to explore here. And so, yeah, I don't pretend that this is some sort of final word on the issue. So hopefully you enjoyed the video, and thank you so much for watching. The next video in this series is going to be on the divine attributes, so that's going to be very exciting. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Joe Schmidt, and this is The Majesty of Reason.